"Sue me," he shrugged, his voice carrying the kind of casual contempt that comes from someone who believes he's correctly identified you as powerless. Someone who thinks that 3 months of non-payment and a handful of threats are enough to establish that you're bluffing about consequences. You can't afford a lawyer anyway. Slumlords like you never can. You'll probably just give up like everyone else does. He was standing in the common hallway of the building where he'd been living rent-free for 97 days, where he'd already damaged walls, where he'd already been warned multiple times about the noise complaints from other tenants, where he'd already positioned himself as someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him. He was looking at me with the kind of contempt that suggested he'd done this before, that he understood how power worked, that he was confident in his assessment that I was someone he could dismiss. So I smiled at him politely, I pulled out my phone, I made a very brief call, and I said, "Yes, I'd like to schedule a meeting with my property manager and my legal team. I have another appointment in an hour, but we can meet at the downtown office afterward." When my property manager, Rebecca Harrison, arrived at the building 45 minutes later in a town car, with a folder containing extensive documentation and a calm, professional demeanor that suggested she'd handled far more complicated situations than this one, the tenant's confidence visibly evaporated. She extended her hand, introduced herself, and said very quietly, "Ma'am, shall we discuss your 47 other buildings while we're here, or would you prefer to resolve this one first?" That's when he understood that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation about who he was dealing with. My name is Margot Ashford, and I'm 45 years old, which means I've lived long enough to understand that invisibility can be a strategic advantage when you're operating in spaces where people expect to see you and don't know how to recognize you when you don't match their preconceived image of power. I come from a family that built wealth through real estate development. My grandfather had started as a contractor in the 1950s and had gradually accumulated parcels of land and built properties across the Midwest. My father had continued that legacy, expanding the portfolio into commercial real estate, retail properties, and eventually residential housing. By the time I was old enough to understand what my family did for work, we owned substantial real estate holdings across 7 states. What most people assumed was that my brothers would inherit the family business, that I would marry someone who could manage that portfolio, or that I would simply occupy a decorative role in the family enterprise. What actually happened was that my brothers pursued other interests. One became a surgeon, one became an academic, and I became obsessed with real estate in a way that seemed to puzzle my father, who asked multiple times whether I was sure this was what I wanted to do with my life, whether I understood how difficult the business could be, whether I wouldn't prefer to focus on other pursuits. I went to Northwestern University and studied real estate development and finance. I worked for a major real estate development company for 8 years, learning the business from acquisition to management to eventual sale or long-term holding. I learned how property values worked, how to identify undervalued properties, how to assess potential for improvement and expansion. I learned the legal framework of property management, tenant law, building codes, renovation requirements. I learned every aspect of the business from the ground up. When I was 31, I asked my father if I could take over management of the family's residential property portfolio. About 60 buildings across the Midwest at that time, mostly apartment buildings in mid-sized cities. My father seemed relieved, actually, to have someone who wanted to actively manage these properties, rather than just collect the income they generated. He gave me substantial autonomy to make decisions about management, renovation, tenant selection, and long-term strategy. What I did with that portfolio was transform it completely. Most of the buildings were older, built in the 1970s and 1980s, well-maintained by my father, but not actively upgraded or modernized. They were generating income, but not substantial returns. I looked at each property individually and assessed what it could become. Some buildings I sold, properties that were in declining neighborhoods or that didn't fit our long-term strategy. Other buildings I extensively renovated, upgrading systems, modernizing interiors, creating properties that could attract higher quality tenants and command higher rents. But what I discovered was that I was also interested in something else. Buying buildings that other investors didn't want, properties that were distressed or undervalued, buildings that were generating problems rather than income. I started acquiring these properties, buildings with structural issues, buildings with difficult tenant situations, buildings in neighborhoods that were considered high risk. I would acquire them at substantial discounts, fix the problems, improve the buildings, and then either manage them long-term or resell them at significant profits. Over the next 14 years, I built an empire of residential and commercial real estate. I personally acquired 47 buildings beyond the original family portfolio. I developed a reputation in the industry for being able to handle complicated situations, for being willing to invest in neighborhoods that other developers avoided, for creating properties that were genuinely nice places to live and work, not just income-generating machines. What I also did was maintain a deliberately low profile. I didn't go to real estate conferences and network extensively. I didn't position myself as a thought leader. I didn't do press interviews or build a public reputation. I operated quietly, acquiring properties methodically, managing them professionally, and generating substantial wealth in the process. My current net worth is approximately $680 million, primarily from real estate holdings and appreciation. I directly own 47 buildings and manage an additional 60 through the family company. I employ a management team of 43 people across 7 states. I generate approximately $85 million in annual revenue from rent and fees. I'm one of the largest residential property owners in the Midwest, and almost nobody knows it, which is exactly how I prefer it. The tenant who confronted me, a man named Derek Williamson, had moved into one of my properties in St. Louis about 4 months earlier. He'd been a decent tenant initially. His background check had come back clean. His references had checked out. He'd passed all the screening requirements. He'd moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building I'd extensively renovated 3 years earlier. A property that had been distressed when I purchased it, and that was now one of the nicest in the neighborhood. The problems started gradually. First, it was late rent, a few days late, but with explanations and promises to catch up. Then it was late by a week. Then it was late by 2 weeks. Then Derek stopped paying altogether. I have property managers and lawyers who handle tenant issues, but when a situation involves direct confrontation, I sometimes take the lead myself, particularly if I think there might be something I can learn from the interaction. I'd had a property manager send Derek multiple notices about the unpaid rent. 3 months of rent was owed $4,500. He'd ignored the notices. He'd ignored the formal eviction warning. He'd ignored the final legal notice from my lawyers stating that eviction proceedings would begin within 14 days if payment wasn't received. So I went to the building myself to talk to him directly. I wanted to understand what was happening. I wanted to know if this was a situation where he was experiencing genuine financial hardship and needed assistance, or if this was someone who had no intention of paying and was counting on the landlord to eventually give up. That's when he made his mistake. He opened the door to his apartment when I knocked, took one look at me, a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in casual clothing, without any obvious markers of authority, and apparently decided I was either a social worker or someone with no real power. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't seem to care. He just launched into a tirade about slumlords and people like me, and how he wasn't going to pay rent to someone who doesn't maintain their properties. I let him finish. I didn't correct him about the building maintenance, which was excellent and would be immediately obvious to anyone who actually looked. I didn't explain who I was. I simply listened to his complaints, and then I said very calmly, "I'm the owner of this building. You owe $4,500 in rent over 3 months. You're going to pay it, or eviction proceedings will move forward." He laughed. He literally laughed at me. And then he said, "Sue me. You can't afford a lawyer anyway. Slumlords like you never can. You'll probably just give up like everyone else does." That's when I made my phone call. Rebecca Harrison, my property manager for the St. Louis market, arrived 45 minutes later. She's a woman in her early 50s with 25 years of experience managing residential properties, with a law degree, with the kind of calm competence that comes from having handled every possible complication in the property management business. She was wearing a tailored suit and carrying a folder thick with documents. When Derek opened the door again and saw her, his confidence noticeably shifted. "Mr. Williamson?" Rebecca said, extending her hand. "I'm Rebecca Harrison, property manager for Ashford Capital Real Estate. This is Margot Ashford, the owner of this building and 46 others in this market. We're here to discuss your lease violation and the unpaid rent." Derek's face went white. I watched as the situation recalibrated in his mind, as he understood that he'd made assumptions about me that were completely wrong, as he recognized that I was not someone who was going to simply disappear or give up. What? He stammered. You owe $4,500 in rent, Rebecca said, her voice remaining perfectly professional. You have 72 hours to pay it in full, or eviction proceedings will commence. Those proceedings include legal fees, court costs, and filing fees that you will be responsible for paying. You'll also be reported to the rental registry, which means your housing options in this city will be substantially limited. But I have reasons, Derek started, but Rebecca cut him off with the kind of polite firmness that suggested she wasn't interested in hearing excuses. Mr. Williamson, the lease you signed is very clear about payment obligations. If you're experiencing financial hardship, there are resources available to tenants. But non-payment is not an option. Ms. Ashford is here to give you an opportunity to resolve this situation. I'd suggest you take it seriously. We left the apartment after that. I didn't need to listen to his explanations or his justifications. I'd been in the property management business long enough to know the difference between someone experiencing genuine hardship and someone who was simply exploiting the system and hoping the landlord would eventually give up. Derek didn't pay within 72 hours. Eviction proceedings commenced. The legal process took about 6 weeks in Missouri, given the formal procedures required. During that time, Derek tried multiple tactics. He filed complaints with the housing authority claiming the building was not properly maintained. Inspectors found nothing wrong with the building. He attempted to contact me directly through social media, claiming I was discriminating against him based on his protected status. His claim had no factual basis. He reached out to local tenant advocacy organizations, who reviewed the situation and essentially said, "You owe rent. Pay it or expect to be evicted." 3 weeks before the eviction was set to be finalized, Derek's family contacted Rebecca and agreed to pay the back rent plus the legal fees associated with the eviction proceedings. The total amount came to $7,200. They paid it. Derek moved out voluntarily rather than face formal eviction. But what happened after was more interesting than the initial confrontation. Derek apparently went on social media and started posting about his experience. He claimed I was a slumlord who was trying to squeeze poor people out of their homes. He claimed I didn't maintain my buildings. He claimed I was predatory and cruel and only interested in extracting maximum value from tenants. He tagged local media outlets and housing advocacy organizations. He created a narrative about a vulnerable person being pushed out by a wealthy landlord with unlimited resources. The problem for Derek was that his narrative didn't match reality. Local media outlets who investigated the situation discovered that I maintained extensive records documenting the condition and maintenance of my properties. They discovered that my buildings consistently had higher quality than comparable properties in the same markets. They discovered that I employed a professional management team dedicated to responding to tenant issues. They discovered that Derek had actually owed substantial rent and had ignored multiple notices before I ever showed up at his apartment. One journalist actually visited several of my properties and wrote a piece about them. The conclusion was that my buildings were well-maintained, professionally managed, and actually represented a significant improvement to the neighborhoods where they were located. The article referenced Derek's situation and noted that in the case of non-payment, the landlord had followed all legal procedures and had given multiple opportunities for resolution. What surprised me was that the media coverage actually enhanced my reputation rather than damaging it. People in the real estate industry reached out with interest in working with me or investing in my properties. Potential tenants seemed to view my properties more favorably after learning about how professionally I managed them. And Derek's social media campaign essentially collapsed under its own lack of credibility. But the experience did teach me something about assumptions and visibility. Derek had assumed that because I didn't fit his preconceived image of a powerful real estate owner, I must not actually be one. He'd made judgments about my resources and my willingness to pursue legal action based on my appearance and my initial demeanor. He'd been completely wrong, but his mistake had cost him. Not just the money he owed, but also the time and stress of eviction proceedings, the damage to his rental history, and the public embarrassment of having his narrative dismantled by journalists. I've used that experience as a teaching moment with my management team. I remind them that people often make assumptions about power based on visible markers: age, gender, appearance, professional positioning. Derek had looked at me and decided I must be powerless. He'd been wrong, and his wrongness had cost him significantly. What I've also recognized is that my invisibility has been strategic. By not building a public reputation, By not positioning myself as a thought leader or industry figure, by operating quietly and methodically, I've been able to operate with less scrutiny, less public judgment, less of the complications that come with being a visible figure in any industry. I've built an empire of nearly 50 buildings in 7 states. I employ 43 people. I generate tens of millions in annual revenue. I own properties that house thousands of people. And I've done it almost entirely without public recognition. Derek's assumption that I couldn't afford a lawyer was almost funny, given that I have lawyers on retainer specifically for situations exactly like his. His assumption that I would give up was based on his previous experience with landlords who were probably less sophisticated in their approach to property management than I am. His assumption that I was powerless was based on looking at me and not seeing what he expected to see. What Derek learned, the hard way, is that assumptions about people based on their appearance or their initial presentation can be completely inaccurate. I'm a woman in my mid-40s, dressed casually, visiting one of my properties in person, rather than having someone else handle it. I don't fit the stereotypical image of someone who owns 47 buildings. But my appearance has nothing to do with my actual resources, my actual power, or my actual willingness to enforce my legal rights. The experience also reinforced something I've always believed. That power doesn't need to announce itself. Real power operates quietly, methodically, with the kind of confidence that comes from actually knowing what you're doing rather than from constantly reasserting your authority or making grand displays of it. I've never publicly shared the story of Derek Williamson, the tenant who tried to intimidate the landlord and didn't realize who he was dealing with. I don't need to. The story serves its purpose. It's a reminder to my management team that assumptions are dangerous, that they can cost us if we're not careful, that the most important thing is to verify facts rather than accept appearances. And it's a reminder to anyone who encounters me in the future that power isn't always obvious, that real wealth often travels quietly, and that making assumptions about people based on how they look is a good way to end up in a situation you didn't expect to be in. Derek learned that lesson the hard way. And I suspect that whenever he hears about someone who seems powerless or insignificant, he probably thinks twice before making assumptions about what they can or cannot do.